So, welcome everyone. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's last unfinished book, The Life of the Mind. Uh, it has a few additions. I'm going to be using, as I've told you, the new critical edition. Edited by a few of my colleagues at Bard and some others. Uh, it's an attempt to bring us back to Arendt's original edition, as well as providing incredibly helpful footnotes and just information about different quotations and citations that Arendt uses. In the sections we're reading today, there's a number of references to Merleau-Ponty and others that the text makes much more accessible than other versions of the text. And so it's if you're able to get it, it's a great text to use, but we can also use the old standby original edition um, uh, that was edited by Mary McCarthy and is out there, and I love that one as well. So, this is, as we've said, a book that Arendt never finished, and it's a book that is somewhat of a departure for her. We all know that she says repeatedly that she's not a philosopher, and yet here she's going to risk doing some philosophy, and so it can be a bit abstract compared to some of her other works. It's always important to remember, as a result, that Arendt, even when she's doing philosophy, is thinking about the world, right? I mean, this book begins with a worldly question, a question that arose from her encounter with Adolf Eichmann. Um, and the question is, to what extent can thinking, an activity of the mind, namely an activity that usually um, withdraws from the world and is unworldly, to what extent can thinking um, maybe prevent the doing of evil in the world? Um, and and so that's we just always have to ground ourselves and remind ourselves that that's where Arendt is coming from. The sort of mantra of the book. I don't. I'm sure. I'm not sure I should use that word, but the in a sense, the thesis of uh, the book, at least um, the the book on thinking, and thinking is the first book of the Life of the Mind, is that the need of reason, right? The need of reason, what reason propels us to think beyond the sensible. The need of reason, that we think beyond the sensible, that we think and we abstract ourselves from the sensible world, is inspired not by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning. And truth and meaning are not the same. The reason we think is not to learn the truth. Um, this is something that really is a constant in Arendt's work, right? We not too long ago read her essay "Truth and Politics," um, in which she says truth is important, but it's not important in politics. And in fact, one of the requirements of politics is that it allow truth to be pursued outside of politics, right? In these other spheres, through institutions that are non-political, and that politics itself is sort of allergic to truth, and truth has a kind of tyrannical stench in politics. And so, on our end, is a political thinker, and her political thought is not about truth. It's about action. It's about meaningfulness. It's about building a common world. It's about friendship, but it's not about truth. Similarly, here in this book, our pursuit is not for truth; it's for meaning. Um, and so, uh, she understands that meaning is an elusive word. more elusive, she says, than the word truth. But she says we have to think about it, um, because it is at the essence of what human thinking strives for. Um, we're now in part one of the book. So, book one is thinking. Part one is called appearance. Why appearance? Well, for a number of reasons. On the one hand, Arendt starts with this um, very bold and somewhat um, crazy, it might seem, assumption or claim that appearing is higher than being. This is a reversal of almost all mainstream philosophy from Aristotle through Heidegger, for whom uh, being, the idea of what is higher than appearance, right? The very assumption of philosophy and then theology and science is that what we see is not true, right? The truth is underneath. Science says, we see all sorts of things, but we have to pierce that. Philosophy says, there's all sorts of appearances in the world, but true being is lasts is what is eternal and what is more true than appearance. And theology, of course, says that what is most true is God, who can't be seen, who has no physical appearance or body. And so Arendt inverts this and says that appearance is either coeval with being or even primary. Um, uh, and yet, and so this, of course, raises a problem for thinking because thinking seems not to appear, right? Um, you know, I was, I used to, I was, there was this movie a number of years ago on Hannah Arendt by the great director Margarete von Trotta, and there was an attempt to portray Hannah Arendt thinking. Well, how do you show thinking, right? It's a very hard things to do. I wrote a review of it once called Smoking and Thinking because so many of the thinking scenes were with Hannah Arendt sitting there, smoking a cigarette. But how do you show somebody thinking? What does that even mean? Um, and the problem that Arendt here confronts is how do you fit thinking into appearances when it seems to always disappear? Deals with the invisible and the soundless. And it raises the question of whether thinking is almost doesn't exist, right? If it's not appearing, how does it exist? Is it an illusion? Um, and how do we appear as thinking beings, beings who are of the world and appear to others? And Arendt is gonna take this seriously and struggle and say, okay, what is the relation um, between thinking and appearing? Um, and that's what this first uh, part of the book on appearance is about. Insofar as uh, things appear, right, they can be illusory, they can be an error. And we're never, she says, going to eliminate all the errors. We're never going to reach beyond appearance and find some true substrate underneath it. Um, the traditional answer to this problem, in at least modern thought, is functionalism. The great advantage of functionalism, the idea that appearances may be error, may be untrue, but they serve a function, right? So a bird's feathers don't tell us anything about the essence of a bird, but they help a bird either by allowing the bird to be camouflaged and thus protect themselves, or through attracting mates in reproduction. And so the scientific approach is to say the appearance is simply functional, and this has the advantage that it turns us towards um, laws of nature that allow us to understand all appearances within a kind of structured whole of functional integrity. Um, but Arendt is very critical of functionalism. She says that the laws of nature, the approach to um, uh, trying to understand all things through a kind of functionalist, mechanist understanding, turns us away from the multiplicity and plurality of organic life. right? We don't look at the beautiful colors of the bird or the gorgeous spots on the butterfly or the infinite variety of maple leaves. We simply say, well, the leaves are there for photosynthesis. And, you know, yeah, there's different ones, but that's an accident. What's important is that they're there for photosynthesis. Um, and these attempts to reduce the vast, infinite multiplicity and plurality of life to laws provides banisters to make true or simple or functional claims about the world, and thus to reduce the complexity of the world. And Arendt worries that in doing so, we forget the value of the world itself, of the things itself. Um, okay, this brings us to where we are in the book for today, to chapter 4, which is called Body and Soul, Soul and Mind. And we are now turning to the question of um, what is it that appears, right, when thinking appears as a semblance, right? And that's what we're going to focus on today. This idea of thinking appears as a semblance, right? There is no underlying inner truth to thinking, right? Um, you know, there's, how do you portray thinking in a photo or in a movie or in a song, right? There's no one right answer. Um, what is thinking, right? I mean, you might have a scientist say, well, thinking is like a machine, and now we're getting all these people who are arguing that if AI is actually teaching us that we were wrong to think about thinking. Thinking is not about some mysterious process or about meaning. Thinking is simply a way of, abstracting, pulling different patterns, pattern recognition from a history of memories that our brain collects in different places and putting them together in new ways. And so, that's an attempt to understand thinking. Okay, Arendt says, well, if we want to understand what thinking is, we have to understand that there's a difference between the soul and the mind. And this may seem a bit esoteric to you, but she thinks it's important. The point is that the soul and the mind are often confused, and her primary target here is John Locke. Um, Locke treats the soul and the mind as basically the same, the inside, of our psychic life, which is not what we can see, but is what is inside. Um, and contra the tradition of Locke, Arendt wants to argue that the mind and the soul are not the same. And so we have to understand the difference. And I'm going to go through a couple of contrasts here to make this clear. It actually ends up being an incredibly fascinating inquiry that she engages in. Um, but so let's try it. The mind, she wants to say, in which we think can be expressed in metaphor, right? Conceptual metaphorical speech is adequate to the activity of thinking and the operations of our mind. When we think, we can express what we're thinking in language. We may say, as that war is like the blood red sea. Obviously, war is not the same as the blood red sea, but we understand the connection, right? She says, though, the soul is beyond metaphor. The life of the soul in its very intensity is much more adequately expressed in a glance, in a sound, in a gesture, rather than in speech, right? So, whereas thinking, whatever we think, we immediately think in speech and we can express it in speech. What we feel in a passion or when we have fear or excitement or anger, it's bodily, right? So thought without speech is inconceivable. You can't actually have a thought without putting it in words. Now, this is obviously, for some people, a controversial claim, right? They're going to want to say, of course, I can have these mystical experiences. And what Arendt is going to say, well, okay, insofar as you have a mystical experience that you can't put in words, you're having that in your soul, not in your mind. Now, is there a difference? Um, you know, who's who? No one's ever been able to locate either the soul or the mind, right? We know where the brain is, and we know where the heart is, but where's the soul and where's the mind? To some degree, this distinction is not a physical one. But she thinks it's a meaningful one. Remember, we're not interested in truth here, we're interested in meaning. Um, Thought and speech anticipate each other in the mind. You can't think without already thinking in a language. Whereas when we're engaged in feelings, um, conceptual language is inadequate. The feelings experienced in the soul cannot even be put into language. They can only be expressed, as she said, in this glance or a gesture. Um, so the passions, the feelings, she wants to say, are the same for everyone. When someone feels fear, it's the same fear I feel and you feel, right? We all feel the same fear. Um, but when we express the fear, when we talk about our fear, we put it in language, and our presentation of the fear to ourselves and others is different than the actual feeling, right? And so she'll say, um, the modern psychology, right, looks at human beings according to our inner fears, our inner urges, our id, our lusts, our fear, our the passions. And she thinks, and this is one of the reasons she's critical of psychology, because she thinks it de-individualizes us. It treats us as simply all the same. We're all subject to the same ugly passions. Um, and it ignores the beautiful way our mind expresses our passions in language that individualizes us. Um, you know, uh, this is what we all do. It's what artists do, I think, incredibly well, right? We take a feeling which is inexpressible in language, and we express it, whether in words or in song or in dance, and we put it into the world and give it a particular meaning. Um, so for Arendt, unlike thinking, which is about something like feelings and passions, um, the passions can't appear, right? They only appear in reflection or in thought. So the show of anger is not the same as the anger I feel. The language of the soul is prior to thought, and thus the language of the soul is not metaphorical or linguistic, whereas our language is. As a result, she wants to say that thought is fundamental. What she means by that is thought is bottomless. Thought actually has no limits, right? Fear is real in some sense, but it can't be expressed. It overflows into the body, she says, and thus it's limited by its bodiliness, by its by its inner reality, which we can't see. But the expression of fear, the show of fear, is limited by nothing except our imagination, our metaphorical imagination, and can be fully separated from reality. And that's the wonder of thinking, is that it is separated from our bodily reality. Um, she here says that Aristotle, much more so than modern psychologists and modern philosophers, gets this right. Um, Aristotle distinguishes between the soul and the mind, the psyche and the nous, and the nous. And Aristotle says that there's no case where the soul can act without a body. The soul and the body are conjoined. But the mind, Aristotle says, can act without the body. This is on page 40 in the critical edition text. Um, So the key difference that she's trying to point to here, and this is what I need you to remember, um, is that the soul is displayed insofar as displayed passively. It appears through the self-display common to all living things, right? When you see somebody look like that, or be exasperated or fearful, or when you see them uh react in some way, there is a display of the soul, but it's connected to the body through the glance, through the inarticulate sounds that come out of us, right? um and against the soul, or differently than the soul, the mind presents itself in a kind of choice, in a wish to appear some way. It's this choice that I want to appear fearful, or I would rather appear courageous, right? Um, that's specifically human. Um, Up to a point, we humans are human insofar as we can choose how to appear to others. But now I hope you're seeing the problem that Arendt has stumbled into, which is that insofar as it's human to appear, and to appear as we choose, not as we are, because we can never appear as we are, because there's no way to see into what we are. All appearance is deceptive. All appearance is illusory. All appearance is a semblance. The inside, right, the soul, the passions are the same for all, but we can never see them. We can never know them. Um, and the way we present in speech is unique to the individual. Um, and she makes some examples here, right? She says that um, lust is the same for everybody. We all have lust, right? And it's sort of ugly, and it's bodily, and it can be um, uh, pretty crude. Um, but love, she says, is beautiful. And it's beautiful because each one of us expresses, sublimates, if you will, if you want to put it in psychiatric language, our lust in love, but gives it its own uh, flavor according to our tastes, right? Love, expresses itself in uniquely human ways, in a plurality of ways, in an in an individuality of ways, that moves us from lust to love, from the soul to the mind. Similarly, fear, right, is an ugly thing. It's indispensable for survival, as is lust. Both fear and lust are necessary if the human race is going to survive, and if the individual is going to survive. But they're pretty, they're pretty awful. But courage, which is a choice not to show fear, and is a thoughtful decision, can be um, beautiful, each in its own way. And so, courage and love are what she calls semblances. They're deceptions. They're hypocrisies to some degree, or they're subject to hypocrisy. This is on page 42 in the critical edition, still in section 4. Um, what separates a semblance from truth is not that one is an appearance and the other is being, because there is no true being that we can ever know. What separates a semblance from truth is the duration and consistency of the semblance, right? If I claim to be courageous, but I constantly refuse to stand up and state my beliefs because I'm scared of the consequences, I look like a hypocrite. Um, and I look like someone who is not true to myself. My my claim of virtuous courage is a promise. It says, I will act courageously in my way. I have to then present myself as I am. I have to offer the semblance of who I am. In a sense, I have to be true to who I am to prove my character and personality. And thus, all attempts to act with character are attempts to uphold a promised semblance that we have chosen for ourselves, right? People of good character are people who uphold the lie, the semblance they tell about themselves, and make it something that is meaningful, not true, but meaningful in the world. We have to, in a sense, create ourselves or present ourselves. This brings us to chapter 5, a short chapter, but a very important transitional chapter, in which what she says is, look, appearance has a double function. It conceals something, an inner something, for example, fear, and it also reveals something on the surface, for example, courage, if that's what you choose. And so what appears is always, or is always a semblance. And here's the key switch that's now going on. It can be an authentic semblance if you um, are able to maintain it and make it meaningful, but it can also be a mere semblance when it simply seeks to deceive and doesn't reveal any meaningful idea of who you are. Since we're all alike inside, she says, the outside is always a semblance. Outside is always a lie or an error in some way. Semblance, error, lying, deception is part of the price we pay for the wonders of appearance. It's a great line on page 43, the beginning of chapter 5, section 5. So semblance is inherent in the world of appearance. But there are no true semblances because there's never a true vision of the inside. This is something she cites Merleau-Ponty for. She's very influenced by Merleau-Ponty in this text. There's no true semblance because you can't ever see inside. But the question, she says, is the semblance a mere semblance or is it an authentic semblance? So what is a mere semblance or what she'll call an inauthentic semblance? They are semblances, appearances, when the choice of appearing is short-lived and arbitrary and simply deceptive and not meaningful as a result. Unauthentic semblances, she says, are unavoidable. They're semblances that we can't live without. They are inherent in the world of appearance. In the world of appearance, which is a world of semblance, there are going to be some semblances which we know are semblances, and yet are essential to live a meaningful life. There are semblances that we can't do without if we're going to live a meaningful human life. Um, and that's the argument she's making here. Now, why has she gone into this, right? Well, on the one hand, we know that thinking is something that generally doesn't appear, and we have this problem of appearances. We know that appearance is prior to and in some sense meaningful as a self-presentation, a self uh, a self-display of all living beings. But what she now wants to say is something else. In appearance, there's also a self-presentation that is human, in which humans need to present themselves in certain ways. And some of these ways are so core to being human that we can't live without them, even though they're semblances. And one of those authentic semblances is what she's going to call the thinking ego, right? Now, we're not reading section 6 on the thinking ego for today, but just so you have a sense of it, right? The thinking ego, what is the thinking ego? Right? The thinking ego is this abstract thing. I think, therefore I am, says Descartes and says Kant. Well, where am I? When am I? Doesn't matter. It's abstract. The thinking ego is not the self. It's this semblance. It's this sort of pure activity of thought. And yet she's going to want to tell us uh, this thinking ego um, is something we humans can't live without. We need to think, or we need to have um, the idea of the thinking ego in order to be human. And so the next three sections of this chapter on appearance are going to be about the thinking ego as an authentic semblance. All right, I'll stop there. And we'll take some questions. As you all know, or many of you know, you can ask questions in the chat. You can discuss things in the chat. I will generally not be able to read the chat because I'm engaged with you talking and those of us who want to talk, and raise their hands and speak. But please be respectful of each other, but enjoy chatting with each other. And there's some really brilliant people here, and it's usually a great resource. If you do want to engage in the public conversation, go down to the react button, click on the little star heart icon, and raise your hand. Just so everyone knows, I have to leave a little bit early today, so we're going to end at about 2:20. But we still have almost an hour for our discussion. I look forward to it. Stephen.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you for your analysis of this text, which I find difficult, and you've clarified it considerably so far. But I want to ask about Arendt's identification of thinking with language, with verbal language, because it seems to me that thinking is involved in the arts besides poetry. Uh, um, a musician will create, you might consider music a language, or what about visual art? And as for the distinction between the soul and the mind, the soul expressing itself through the body, seems to me that an actor playing a part will give a lot of thought to exactly how his or her body expresses itself, and that this would seem to be an expression of thought and not necessarily of the spontaneous soul of that person.
Thanks, Stephen. Those are great questions. Yeah. So first of all, I agree with you that art in general is a thoughtful endeavor, and Arendt agrees with you as well. If you go back and read her account of the work of art and of art in the human condition and other places, she says that the main activity of the artist is to be a thinker. Um, and that what the artist does in thinking is step away from the world, right? Withdraw from the world, which is why she says that artists can't be very worldly citizens. Um, it's it's I guess this is obviously a controversial claim on her part. She says that if you're going to be an artist who creates something new and makes people think, your thinking is going to have to be um, somewhat new and original. And as a result, she thinks that there's a reason that artists often, go to the mountains or withdraw from the world. Um, they need that space to come up with new thoughts. And then that's true for all thinkers. What makes the artist unique is that they then take that new thought and seek to um, put it into the world in an artwork, whether that artwork is poetry or a novel or a painting or a symphony or a dance. Um, they put that work in there, and she says once they put that work into the world, they lose control of it. Right? It becomes a work, and as a work of art, people will see it or hear it or experience it, and either find it boring and ignore it, uh, find it offensive because it's new and dangerous, and cancel it or censor it, uh, or they'll be inspired by it and they'll talk about it, and that artwork will become a new, meaningful part of the world in which we live. Uh, and so, um, we will talk more about this, a lot more about this, later in the text in chapters. I think I think it's chapters 12 and 13, but I don't know if I have that exactly right, which are on metaphor and language. Chapter 13 is metaphor and the ineffable. And when we come to these chapters, we'll be talking a lot more about these questions of art and the way philosophy, art, and language work in these situations. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for her, a painting or a music or a work of music is still metaphorical. It's still linguistic. Um, but that said, I think in a work of music where the voice can or the instrument can vibrate and express itself in a more physical and bodily way than a written word, oral poetry, right? I mean, I think it's a mistake to see poetry as simply the words on a page. Um, uh, Poetry, at least in Arendt's idea, is to be listened to and read. It's not an accident that she has often claimed to have memorized the entire corpus of German classical poetry. Um, it's to be spoken. And so whether you're dancing or speaking poetry or painting, there are the intensity of brushstrokes, right? The intensity of an action, the glance, the gesture. And these things are for her um, ways to express the soul. And art is not just about thinking. It's also, I think, about the soul. Um, uh, that's what maybe separates an artist from a philosopher in some way. I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little more. Um, but um, but I think that that could be true as well. Um, but art doesn't want to simply express the soul. It wants to express the soul and also subject it to thought, at least as she understands it. Um, your question about the actor, I think I've to some degree I've answered that. An actor, right, is someone who um, uh, uses their body as well as their words to inhabit a character and offer a feeling. And yet, insofar as the actor is acting in accordance with the writing of an artist, uh, they are also seeking to not simply uh, um, blurt out something that is original to their body, but actually is artificial, right? They're an actor is someone who wears a mask and expresses some not their inner truth, but the meaning of the text in which they are, or which has been written for them. Um, and so I think those are helpful analogies, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's a great response.
Thank you, Connor.
Hey, Roger, thanks so much for the explanation of the reading that we just did. There was just a little part I was confused by. It's like the last paragraph of section 5. She quotes Kant saying, "Time, the only form of inner intuition, has nothing permanent." I didn't really understand what Kant is talking about or why I think she disagrees with him, but I wasn't clear about that either.
Okay. Um, so she says, I'm just going to read it so I have it in front of me. Right after footnote 32, where she's citing Merleau-Ponty, which I talked about in my presentation, right? For where, when, and how has there ever been a vision of the inside, right? There is none, she thinks. She says, emotions and inner sensations are unworldly in that they lack the chief worldly property of standing still and remaining at least long enough to be clearly perceived and not merely sensed, to be intuited, identified, and acknowledged. So emotions and inner sensations don't stand still. They're constantly in motion. They're not thoughts that we can ponder. They're constantly changing. Um, and and thus they can't be clearly perceived. Again, according to Kant, and this is where you asked, time, the only form of inner intuition, has nothing permanent. Um, okay, so this is this actually requires knowing a little bit about Kant. Um, uh, Time and space for Kant um, are what she calls inner intuitions. Um, uh, uh, they are we don't actually there is no what is time, right? I mean, it's not there's no clock of the universe. And one day could be 100 years or it could be 1 second. Um, and what she says is that time is the fact that we think in temporal qualities is inherent in the human brain, which thinks things through temporality and spatiality, and it imposes temporal and spatial distinctions on all things. Um, uh, so there's nothing permanent to time. It's a human invention. It's part of the human way we intuit the world. And then in the parentheses, she says, in other words, when Kant speaks of time as the form of inner intuition, he speaks, albeit without being aware of it, metaphorically, and he draws his metaphor from our spatial experiences, which concern outside appearances. It is precisely the absence of form and hence of the possibility of intuition um, that characterizes the experience of inner sensations. Time, she's saying, in Kant, is actually thought already on the metaphor of space, because we see distinctions between a tree and a bush, and we see a spatial distinction between them. Now, of course, that also, to some degree, is an intuition and is a human imposition because we could see them all as part of the same blob. But once we make that distinction and we break the world up into spatial categories, um, we can also then begin to break the world up into uh, temporal categories through our inner intuition. Um, and so that's what she's talking about here. It's not um, it's someone it's a thought that comes to someone who's read a lot of Kant. What she's the reason it she's talking about it here is that insofar as she wants to say that there is no true inside and that there's no way to have that appearance is a semblance. It's not true, but there's no such thing as a true semblance because there's nothing true inside. It's all based on how we intuit it. And here she's simply saying, if you understand Kant, that's what he tells you, which is that, time, there's no truth to time. It's an inner intuition. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Roger.
Um, just want to make sure, I'm just looking at the queue. I want to encourage anyone who wants to ask questions. And we'll try and get as many different people as we can. Max, you're up next.
Hi. Well, first, I wanted to thank Stephen for his question and you for your answer. It helped me streamline my own question. Um, Toward the top, you were discussing how advocates of AI might think about thinking or how they might describe thinking, and that we've been getting it wrong all along. And the way you described that was thinking is actually using old patterns in new ways. And I think it's the word new there that kind of uh, triggered me to think about a couple of other things. One of them is that's virtually a summary of T.S. Eliot's position and tradition in the individual talent, in which he says essentially there's nothing new under the sun. The role of the artist is to take that inheritance of the tradition and then, in a way, rearrange it using the creative spark. And that newness, Arendt's use of the word natality, um, and the ability to bring newness in the world. And she kind of contextualizes that even within this text with habit. Some things can't be taught, but habit is there, and then habit meets natality. And so you had said at one point that she says elsewhere, I think in The Human Condition, that the main activity of the artist is thinking. I'm wondering, can we make that reflexive? Is the main activity of thinking creativity? That spark that Eliot talks about, the something new, making something new out of what is given. Um, if that's true, is it that art, very broadly conceived as an act of creativity, is that the link with the world? Is art, in essence, the if let's say we distinguish this between Socrates' epiphanies, where he seems to kind of momentarily disinhabit the world, um, as maybe the instance of philosophy, Socratically conceived, that's different from thinking meeting the world in art. I'm trying to disentangle a lot of this
No, I
stuff.
mean these are excellent questions, Max. And as was Stephen as well, you're jumping us ahead, which is fine. Um, but yes, I think everything you've said makes a lot of sense and is right. Um, uh, if thinking is the way in which a human being um, uh, takes their experiences and rearranges the language available to them, the metaphors that have been used, and the linguistic and concepts that have been created to create new concepts and new metaphors and new insights from their feelings, then I think you're right. Thinking is creative. And that's going to be part of her argument, right? Part of this is an argument against um, philosophy as it's been practiced as a conceptual enterprise, and arguing that instead philosophy is a metaphorical enterprise, um, and thus thinking, or thinking at least, as opposed to philosophy, is engaged in the creative act of metaphering, of carrying us over into new insights and in fact making new worlds. Um, and so I think you're right. There's without a doubt, an artistic impulse to her um, idea of thinking that we'll be exploring throughout, this book. We'll get really into it in a couple of weeks. Um, all of that I think is right. I don't know how much to say about AI with that in mind. You know, if artificial intelligence is about scouring the written texts of the world um to encounter um all the different patterns that it can, um and be able to take them and write something creative, unexpected, that's never been written before. Well, is that creativity? Um, you know, one might say yes. Now, but when I was talking with Stephen earlier, what I said also is that artists don't simply work in concepts and words. They also work in feelings and emotions um, and experiences. And how does an AI have those, right? Well, can we create embodied AIs, right? And so there may be a way in which someone might say, well, AI can be creative, but it can't be human because it doesn't have the soul. All it has is the mind. Well, does it even have one answer is, does it even have, one question is, does it even have the mind, right? Is it just a brain or is it actually creative? And that's the debate that I think people are having around the question of generative AI. But then there's the question, which is also there, which is, well, it may, even if it were to have a mind, which is questionable, does it have a soul? And what would it mean to unleash the most powerful mind in the universe upon the world when that mind is without a soul? And I think that's the question that we're all sort of struggling with right now.
Thank
Yeah. George. Now, George, you're muted, so you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it was a wonderful explanation of, on a very high intellectual level of what Hannah Arendt was doing here. I'd just like to go on a different framing, which came to mind as I was reading, what's her name? Suzanne Vrem,
Broman?
yeah, Bremen as a defense of Arendt against the accusation that she was a non-Jewish Jew, and it has to do with a different way of looking at the mere versus authentic semblance and appearance, and that is something that I think that every Jew who, including Arendt, who has survived World War II, will understand. And I don't know whether it's so much that the Americans until recently would understand. And that's another way of talking about appearance. And that's talking about surviving as passing as an Aryan, which is really passing as a simulated person. A person who was thought to look Jewish was said to have a bad appearance. Anyone with black, especially curly hair or dark eyes or a prominent nose, was seen as having a bad appearance and would be assumed to be Jewish. Now, this was in Poland, but I'm sure to an extent it was in Germany and other places in Europe. Persons with blonde hair and blue eyes would be said to have a good appearance. And Jews who happen to possess such physical characteristics could sometimes pass as Poles or as Christians. Now, this is something that really struck me about Arendt, because I'm sure that she was, just by reading Suzanne Bremen, that she was aware of that particular aspect of it, and it was really not something that she was sympathetic with. Looking at, let's say, her writings on Rachel Vermeulen, Rachel Vermeulen fit the so-called bad appearance thing, and to an extent, so did Rent. And I think that just having that aspect of it to think about would make you over intellectualize the other aspects of it. So, and when you think about it, that's a very functional way of looking at appearance. In order to survive, you have to appear a certain way. And she was very, very resistant to looking at it a functional way. And this has to do the same thing with, uh, for instance, like Verhagen
Okay.
said mere appearance or mere whatever, mere authentic semblance, because she was really just a parvenu all the way through until the end. Arendt, on the other hand, was a conscious pariah uh, early on during the war, to her credit. But then she was, and according this is to Suzanne Verman, a conscious pariah in New York when it was safe to be one.
Yeah. Thank you, George. I mean, I think, the connection between her discussion of um the doubleness of appearance and her lifelong attention to and concern with the problems of assimilation, I think is very helpful and right on. Um uh um I think uh her critique of assimilation, right, is that um you can't assimilate on the one hand because to do so is to deny in an essential way who you are, whether it's as a Jew or a black or whatever. Um, and also because the people in the end will always still see you as Jewish. Um, and so you know, there's no there's no way to there's no true assimilation. Now, what you can say is, maybe that there may be authentic assimilations, where you are able to assimilate and yet also um, maintain a truth as to who you are. Um, and in many ways, you know, that's the ideal of hyphenated identity, which really, was an American invention, right? The Jewish American, the Black American, the Arab American, whatever it is, the idea that you can be both, that you can um, embrace both sides of it, and I think that that's what Arendt loved about America, rightly or wrongly, if she was, that it's possible. But that idea of a meaningful assimilation that's not attempting to be a true assimilation, I think, is something to think about that fits quite well with what we're reading. So thank you. Um, Haley,
Hi.
hi.
I'm trying to figure out how to articulate my question. I think I'm just really confused and struggling to understand this bit.
Thank you. I'm glad you
Apologies.
said that.
So to my mind, what she's saying, so your soul is your emotion, it's your feeling, isn't it? It's the feelings that we have that sit in our body, and then our thoughts. This almost like it's a separation. So you're almost able to step out of yourself, outside of your body, and look in and go, right, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm experiencing in my body, and now I'm going to choose to present that to the outside world in a particular way. So it's almost like your thought. I thought of it as like a postcard. You're sending a postcard from your soul to the outside world to this is what it's like, and then on sharing that your thoughts with the outside world, you then get the opportunity to then see yourself reflected back, and then you might go back it that might then change your soul, or it might change how you feel. So if you're boiling with anger, or so fearful inside, but then talking out loud about that with others, then that, and listening back to others, or going out into the world and sharing that, and then looking around you and kind of getting this objective reality back, you might then change that fear might then disperse inside yourself. I'm not sure if I've got that right. But and then my second confusion is how she talks about love in this section. So I think it's like a couple of paragraphs towards the end of section 4. I think she talks about love, but she describes love as the postcard. So she says, like, the sexual desire is the bodily passion, the bodily feeling that we all share, and then the way that we express the love, or the way that we love, is then different to all of us. But that doesn't make sense to me, because I thought love was love as a soul thing or an emotional thing. And so I can't make sense of it. And I'm thinking, just is it that we feel love, but then
No, I
but
think
then
love for her would be something we express through language and through our mind.
okay,
Love is the choice of how we present our lust, right?
okay,
Um, so first of all, everything you
yeah,
said in the first part seemed right to me, so I'm not sure where you're
okay,
confused. Um,
okay, that's
but
good.
but on the second part, I think the confusion is this, that um, you know, I mean, the claim is that all people have a kind of lust, that they, sexual energy, um a need to, engage sexually, and and that drive,
Mm,
which is non-linguistic and animalistic, if you will, and connects us to animals and all living beings, um, is necessary, and yet quite at times, it's not beautiful. It's it's not ugly in the sense of, it's ugly in the sense that it's it's all the same. It's like a blob, and there would be no distinctions. Everyone would be feeling the same thing.
mhm,
But love, in her mind, is when somebody uh changes their lust into a desire for, whether it's a young man or a young woman or a great book. Um,
mhm,
and they choose what they love, and they present themselves as a lover of wisdom, a philosopher, or a lover of young boys, or a lover of young women, or a lover of older boys, or a lover of older women. Um, and people choose their to express and present their love in all sorts of ways.
mhm,
Um, and and that's beautiful. And what she says is, um, without the sexual urge, love would not be possible, right? You wouldn't,
mhm,
we would never have thought of love probably without that sexual urge. But while the urge is always the same, how great is the variety in the actual appearances of love? To be sure,
mhm,
one may understand love as the sublimation of sex. So she's saying, yeah, if you're a psychoanalyst, you can say love is simply, a way of making lust uh, culturally acceptable or civilized. So it's a sublimation of it. But you can only understand it that way, she says, if one keeps in mind that there would be no sex as we understand it without love. Um, yeah, there would be procreation, but there wouldn't be sex. Um,
mhm,
and that without some intervention of the mind, love, without a deliberate choice, love, between what pleases and displeases us, we would never even choose a sexual partner. I mean, maybe we would have sex, in sort of random way, but it would not be what we think of as sex. Um, so I think those examples are helpful to understand exactly what you said before, how the
okay,
soul is confronted is composed of these bodily emotions, these feelings that we can express them, but only in the most um, inarticulate ways, through, grunts and glances. Whereas love, can be expressed through language and metaphors and roses and waterfalls and all
mhm.
sorts of things.
Thank you, Roger. I think now I realise where I've got confused is because in other writings of hers, there's different kinds of love that she talks about, but I think in this particular section, it's a very specific type of love, isn't it? It's that, yeah, it's that love as you described, rather than the civic friendship or your neighbourly
Exactly.
love, all that kind of thing. I think that's where, yeah,
Exactly. Yes.
I've
Yeah.
thought too much about it.
No, I mean, you have to be a little careful in reading Arendt in this book, The Life of the Mind, because she's really engaging in a different discourse here, a more
Mhm,
philosophical discourse than many of her other works. And
mhm,
so one has to be aware that um, she's sometimes going to use words in their Kantian way or in their Augustinian or Aristotelian way, and you actually have to be a little bit careful about just applying her earlier works to this one.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks, Roger.
You're very welcome, Glenn.
Hey, Roger, I'm still reeling about your Arendtian take of a tyrannical stench to truth in politics. I'm going to suggest that to our youngest son as the name for his next band. But keeping it about the possibility of a common world, what does that tyrannical stench, Roger, mean to the possibility of a fact-checking industry, a meaningful fact-checking industry to guide and correct our real-world political discourse and debate? Does it do any real good to make a case with evidence that someone in politics is lying, or am I misunderstanding here? Would Arendt be a fact checker?
So, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I've actually written a number of different essays and sometimes blog posts on fact checking, and I
Okay, I'll
mean,
go search those out.
and I think even in the book, The Perils of Invention, one of the books I edited recently, I have both by me and I've by some other people as well, some essays on fact checking.
Thank you.
But I don't know, were you with us, Glenn, when we talked about truth and politics about a month or two ago?
I might have missed that one.
You
I
might have missed
apologize.
that one. So, I mean, we did basically, it would be a good place to go is her essay
Okay.
Truth and Politics, or go back and listen to the podcast on Truth and Politics. It was in two parts. But basically, I don't want to repeat myself completely, but for Arendt, facts matter, right? And yet, facts in politics are A, easily negated, and B, contingent,
Right.
and C, the easiest way to counter facts is to turn them into opinions. If you say, to use an easy example right now, X won an election, and someone says, I think Y won the election, and you say, well, you can't you can't deny facts, and they say, well, it's just my opinion. You've turned the claims of facts into opinions. Now, what Arendt does say, right, is that what makes a fact about winning an election, right? Is it that there were the most votes? Okay. Is it that certain states certified the votes in one way, right? Is it that what happens when an X number of ballots are disqualified for whatever reason? What happens when people say, oh well, people voted by mail, and that's not a real way of voting? Or when people say that signatures didn't match, and then you have judges, a court, making decisions about whether this is a real thing or not. And it's a fact that when you go through the process, X won the election. But Y can say, well, I think the judges made the wrong opinion. And Y can say, I think that, voting by mail is not the equivalent of real in-person voting. The point is, and Y can say that, COVID made this election illegitimate, etc. The point is that Arendt wants to insist that we not lose sight of the facts. But what she is deeply aware of is that most disagreements in the end are not about brute facts, they're about our interpretations of the facts. And in the end, they're about our opinions about the facts. And so, to get to a final answer to the question of who won the election is, in her mind, both a matter of fact and a matter of opinion. We have to convince enough people that the way all the facts are interpreted is authoritative and has public meaning. And that's not easy to do, uh, especially at a time when people distrust all authority and distrust lawyers and judges and administrators and government officials and all the people who are saying, well, we've checked this and we think that this is legitimate. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean it is legitimate, or it means you think it's legitimate? What is your source of legitimacy? And this is the problem, is that there are facts, but most people who say X won the election and most people say Y won the election actually have very little personal experience of the facts upon which they're basing that judgment, right? They are largely basing their judgment on a trust or a distrust of certain legal, political actors. And at that point, it becomes a matter of opinion rather than a matter of fact.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Harold. I can't hear you. Harold, you gotta unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm putting up the cover of this book, Computer Power and Human Reason by Joseph Weizenbaum, because there's a lot of talk about AI and thinking. And this book is from 1976. He was one of the most brilliant computer scientists at MIT. The book is called Computer Power and Human Reason from Judgment to Calculation. I suggest people read it. It's available free online. He put it there before he passed. And I just want to read this very quickly. But is the mind nothing more than a superbly complex machine? Is life simply a program running on an enormous computer, a program that can be cast in the abstract symbols of modern science? No, writes Joseph Weizenbaum. The individual human being, like any other organism, is defined by the problems he confronts. He must necessarily confront problems that arise from his unique biological and emotional needs. No other organism, and certainly no computer, can be made to confront genuine human problems in human terms.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think the question, Harold, right, that some people would say is, why not? Why can't you either program a computer to experience, particular problems or worldviews, or embody a computer and let them begin to have experiences? I'm not going to answer the question. I'm just saying that these are, I think, the outlines of the question that this book, your book that you brought up, is raising, and that Arendt is going to help us think through. But
Yeah.
the question of what, it's one thing, what is mind, and is the mind relation of the mind to the brain, but it's a whole nother is what's the relation of the mind to the soul or mind to the body, and there's not one answer to that. Okay,
I think she would have appreciated, let me say quickly, because I know you're running out of time. She would have appreciated him. He wrote a program way back when called ELIZA, which was to demonstrate the futility of trying to create computer-human interaction on a level above, mathematics or complex equations, whatever. And you could ask a question, and he had a whole list of psychological responses, and he thought this was to show the absurdity of using a computer as a psychologist.
Yeah.
However, the world took it up, and you can still read about it. Eliza, people actually use it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So thank you.
Okay.
We're going to take one last question from Vigdis, but before I do, I just want to make two quick announcements. One is I realize that some of our European guests, I'm seeing this in the chat, came on an hour late. It's because we went on to daylight savings time last week, and in Europe, I don't think you go on to daylight savings time for another 2 weeks. So I apologize that that happened to people, and I'm sorry that people are disappointed. This will be the whole conversation will be put on YouTube and also next Friday on the podcast. So if you'd like to catch up, you'll be able to. So I do apologize, or I mean, it's not my fault about Europe and America can't get their act together on a lot of things these days, but this is one older than that, and etc. So, and also just to remind us that next week we will be readings sections 7, 6, and 7, which leaves us just with section 8 for later, but it's good because these are complicated sections. So for next Friday, sections no, next Friday we don't meet, but in 2 weeks, we're reading sections 6 and 7. So no meeting next week, because it's our spring break, and then after that, 6 and 7. Vigdis, you'll get the last question.
It was actually into the same about artificial intelligence, and because I was thinking of this when Alan talks about thinking from experience, that all thinking goes from experience, and experience is related to appearances, and it has to do with our perception of the world. I think it's much the same when she talks about comprehension as facing up to what really is. And I think that might be something that is quite difficult in artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence using all this written language and making their answers from kind of past written things that have been written, and not from new perceptions. So is there something that would make it would be especially human, and only that human reason differs from artificial intelligence in the way we perceive the world, in the way that we kind of have that function combining perception and reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's her claim, right? Is that, all living beings have an urge to display, right? Whether it's butterflies or plants or whatever. But what distinguishes humans and even and dogs or cats or animals, she thinks, can express a kind of bodily, character, soul to some degree. But it's really only humans that she thinks have this ability to choose what part of themselves to present to the world through their mind. And that's, I think, one understanding of what Arendt thinks is uniquely human. So, yes, that is that, and this question of to what extent a machine, which might be able to do the mental choosing part and creativity part, but is without the access to the soul and the body, to what extent is it cut off from that? So yeah, I think those are important questions. Okay, just a reminder, next week is the 21st. I believe that is still 2 days before Europe goes on to daylight savings time. So you're only 5 hours ahead of us next week. And then but no, I apologize. We are not meeting next week. We are meeting next the 28th, and I believe Europe will be back to 6 hours. So we'll see you at the normal time in 2 weeks. I apologize about that. 2 weeks, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you then. Thanks all very much.
Thank you.
Gracias,
Thanks, everyone.
excelente,
Bye, everybody.
excelente.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Ciao, ciao.
Roger.